This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 21 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Other Sufferings of the Soul in this Night. The third suffering and affliction of the soul is the consequence of the meeting of the two extremes together, the human and the divine. The latter being the purgative contemplation, the human being the soul itself. When the divine touches the soul to renew it and to ripen it, so as to make it divine, to detach it from its habitual afflictions and qualities of the old man, to which it clings and adheres most closely, it so breaks and bruises it, swallowing it up in profound darkness, that the soul seems to perish and waste away at the sight of its own wretchedness by a cruel spiritual death. It feels as if it were swallowed up and devoured by a wild beast, suffering the pangs of Jonas in the belly of the whale. For it must lie buried in the grave of this obscure death, that it may attain to the spiritual resurrection for which it hopes. David describes the nature of this pain and suffering, though it really baffles description, saying, "The sorrows of death surround me, the sorrows of hell encompassed me. In my affliction I called upon the Lord, and I cried to my God." But the greatest affliction of the soul in this state is the thought that God has abandoned it, of which it has no doubt, that He has cast it away into darkness as an abominable thing. This belief in its own abandonment is a most grievous and pitiable affliction. David experienced the same trials when he said, "Like the slain sleeping in the sepulchres, of whom thou art mindful no more, and they are cast off from thy hand. They have laid me in the lower pit, in the dark places, and in the shadow of death. Thy wrath is strong over me, and all thy waves thou hast brought in upon me." For in truth, when the soul is in the pangs of purgative contemplation, the shadow of death and the pangs of hell are most acutely felt, for these consist in the sense of its being without God, that He has abandoned it in His wrath and cast it down beneath the burden of His heavy displeasure. All this and even more the soul feels, for a fearful apprehension has come upon it that thus it will be with it for ever. It also has the same sense of abandonment with respect to all creatures, and that it is an object of contempt to all, especially to its friends. And so the psalmist continues, saying, "Thou hast put away my acquaintance far from me. They have set me an abomination to themselves." The prophet Jonas also, as one who had experience of this, both bodily and spiritually, witnesses to the same truth, saying, "Thou hast cast me forth into the deep, in the heart of the sea, and a flood hath compassed me. All thy billows and thy waves have passed over me, and I said, I am cast away out of the sight of thine eyes, but yet I shall see thy holy temple again." This is the purgation of the soul, that it may see God. "The waters have compassed me about, even to the soul. The deep hath enclosed me, the sea hath covered my head. I went down to the lowest part of the mountains. The bars of the earth have shut me up for ever." The bars of the earth are the imperfections of the soul, which prevent it from the enjoyment of this sweet contemplation. The fourth kind of pain is caused by another excellence peculiar to this obscure contemplation, the sense of God's majesty and greatness. This makes the soul conscious of the other extreme, its own poverty and misery, and this is one of the chief sufferings of this purgation. The soul is made conscious of a profound emptiness and an utter destitution of the three kinds of goods, natural, temporal, and spiritual, which are ordained for its comfort. It sees itself in the midst of the opposite evils, miserable imperfections and aridities, its faculties devoid of all apprehensions, and the spirit abandoned in darkness. And, inasmuch as God is now purifying it in its sensitive and spiritual substance, in its interior and exterior powers, it is necessary for it that it should become empty, poor and abandoned, arid, destitute, and obscured. For the sensitive part is purified in aridities, the faculties in the absence of all apprehensions, and the spirit in the obscure darkness. Now God effects this by means of obscure contemplation, wherein the soul not only suffers from the absence and suspension of all natural support and apprehensions, which is a most painful trial, like a person held by the throat and suffocated, but all its affections and the imperfect habits contracted in the world are also purged away, annihilated, emptied out of it, or consumed within it, as the rust and mold of metal is burnt away in the fire. But, as these things are most deeply rooted in the soul, the sufferings and interior trials which it has to endure are heavy, and in addition to the destitution and emptiness, natural and spiritual, of which I have spoken. The words of the prophet are now fulfilled. Heap together the bones, which I will burn with fire. The flesh shall be consumed, and the whole mixture shall be sodden, and the bones shall dry away. This describes the path which the soul suffers in the sensitive and spiritual parts when it is in this state of emptiness and poverty. And so the prophet proceeds, saying, Set it also empty upon hot burning coals, that the brass thereof may wax hot and be melted, and let the filth of it be melted in the midst thereof, and let the rust thereof be consumed. This is the heavy trial of the soul in the purifying fires of contemplation. The prophet says that, in order to purge away and consume the filth of the afflictions which are within the soul, it is necessary for it, in a certain way, to be annihilated and undone, because its passions and affections have become natural to it. And therefore the soul, because it is purified in this furnace, like gold in a crucible, according to the words of wisdom, as gold in the furnace he hath proved them, feels itself consumed away in its innermost substance, in this absolute poverty wherein it is as if it were lost. This truth is clearly taught us by the psalmist, saying, Save me, O God, for the waters are come in even unto my soul. I stick fast in the deep mire, and there is no sure standing. I am come into the depth of the sea, and a tempest hath overwhelmed me. I am weary of crying, my jaws are made hoarse, my eyes have failed, whilst I hope in my God. Here God is humbling the soul, that he may exalt it hereafter, and if it were not his will that these feelings, when they rise, should be quickly lulled again, the soul would almost immediately depart from the body. But they occur only at intervals, in their greatest violence. They are occasionally so acute that the soul seems to see hell and perdition open before it. They who are in this state are those who go down alive into hell, and have their purgatory in this life, for this is the purgation to be endured there for venial sins. And thus he who passes through this state in the present life, and is purified, either enters not into purgatory, or is detained there but a moment, for 1 hour here is more than many there. Section 22 of the Obscure Night of the Soul, by St. John of the Cross. Other afflictions and trials of the will. The afflictions of the will and its trials here are also immense. They occasionally pierce the soul with a sudden recollection of the evils that environ it, and of the uncertainty of any relief. To this is superadded the memory of past happiness, for souls of this kind, when they enter into the night, have, generally, had much sweetness in God, and served him greatly. But now, to see themselves strangers to so much happiness, and unable to recover it, causes them the greatest affliction. This was the experience of Job also, for he said, I, sometime that wealthy one, suddenly am broken. He hath held my neck, broken me, and set me to himself, as it were a mark. He hath compassed me with his spears, he hath wounded my loins, he hath not spared, and hath poured out my bowels on the earth. He hath torn me with wound upon wound. He hath rushed in upon me like a giant. I have sewed sackcloth upon my skin, and have covered my flesh with ashes. My face is swollen with weeping, and my eyelids are dim. So many and so great are the torments of this night, and so many are the illustrations of them furnished by the holy writings, that time and strength would fail me, were I to attempt to enumerate them. For beyond all doubt, all that can be said of them will fall short, and the illustration before us will enable us to form conjecture as to the others. And now, to conclude the subject of the first line of the stanza, and to show what this night is to the soul, I will repeat here what the prophet Jeremiah has said of it. I am the man that sees my poverty in the rod of his indignation. He hath led and brought me into darkness, and not into light. Only against me he hath turned again and again his hand all the day. He hath made my skin and my flesh old. He hath broken my bones. He hath built around me, and he hath compassed me with gall and hardship. In dark places he hath placed me as the everlasting dead. He hath built round about against me, that I go not forth. He hath made my fetters heavy. Yes, and when I cry and ask, he shutteth out my prayer. He hath shut up my ways with square stones. He hath made my path crooked. He is come to me as a bear lying in wait, as a lion in secret places. He hath turned aside my paths, and hath broken me. He hath made me desolate. He hath bent his bow, and hath sent me a mark for the arrow. He hath shot into my reins the daughters of his quiver. I am made a laughingstock to all my people, their song all the day. He hath filled me with bitterness. He hath inebriated me with wormwood, and he hath broken my teeth one by one. He hath fed me with ashes, and my soul is repelled from peace. I have forgotten good things, and I said, my end and my hope is perished from the Lord. Remember my poverty and transgression, the wormwood and the gall. I am mindful and remember, and my soul languisheth within me. These lamentations of the prophet, which so vividly depict the sufferings of the soul, refer to those trials and afflictions which come upon it in this purgation and spiritual night. That soul is worthy of all compassion which God leads into this dreadful and horrible night. For, although it is well within it because of the great blessing in store, and of which this night is the source, since God will raise up good things for it out of this darkness, and bring light over the shadow of death, as it is written, He discovereth deep things out of darkness, and bringeth up to light the shadow of death, so that His light shall be as extensive as the darkness that is past. The darkness thereof and the light thereof are alike. Nevertheless, on account of the immense sufferings it endures, and the great uncertainty of any relief, for it imagines that its calamities will never come to an end, God having made it to dwell in darkness as those that have been dead of old, the spirit is in anguish within it, and the heart within it is troubled. Its condition is one of deep suffering, and greatly to be pitied. Besides, the soul derives now no consolation from the advice that may be given it, or from its spiritual director, because of the loneliness and desolation which overwhelm it in this obscure night. Though its confessor may set before it in many ways the grounds of comfort which are to be had in the blessings which these its sufferings imply, yet the soul will not believe him. For being absorbed in the sense of the evils that environ it, and seeing clearly its own misery, it imagines that its spiritual director, not seeing what itself sees and feels, speaks as he does without comprehending its case. It is pained anew instead of being comforted, for it considers that his counsel is no remedy of the evil it suffers from, which is most true, for no relief, no remedy is possible for that pain. This is the more so, inasmuch as the soul is powerless here, like a prisoner in his dark cell, bound hand and foot, unable to move or see, and shut out from all help whatever, until our Lord shall have accomplished the purgation of the soul in His own way. until the spirit is softened, humbled, and purified, until it becomes so refined, simple, and pure as to become one with the Spirit of God in that degree of the union of love which He in His mercy intends for it, and corresponding to which is the greater or less violence, the longer or shorter duration of this purgation. But if this purgation is to be real, it will last, notwithstanding its vehemence, for some years, but admitting of intermissions and relief, during which, by the dispensations of God, the obscure contemplation, divested of its purgative form and character, assumes that of the illuminative and of love. Under this form of it, the soul, like one escaped from the dungeons of its prison into the comfort of space and freedom, enjoys the sweetness of peace and the loving tenderness of God in the flowing abundance of spiritual communications. This is to the soul a sign of the spiritual health which is being wrought within by this purgation, and a foretaste of the abundance it hopes for. So much so is this at times that it thinks all its trials are over. For such is the nature of spiritual things, when they are most purely spiritual, that when trials return, the soul thinks they will never end, and that all its goodness has perished, and when it prospers in its spiritual course, it thinks that all its calamities are past, and that it shall always abound in good things. Thus it was with David when he said, "In my abundance I said, I shall never be moved." The reason of this is that the actual enjoyment of one thing in the mind is inconsistent with the enjoyment of its contrary. But this is not the case quite in the sensitive part of the soul, because of the weakness of its apprehensions. But as the spirit is not yet wholly purified and cleansed from the afflictions of the inferior nature, though more resolute and consistent now, it is still liable to pains, so far as it is under the dominion of these affections. This is evident in the life of David, for when his state changed, he was in affliction, though he had said, in the day of prosperity, "I shall never be moved." Thus the soul, in the actual enjoyment of spiritual blessings, but not observing the radical imperfections and impurities which still remain, thinks that all its trials are over. This thought, however, is of rare occurrence. For until the spiritual purgation is complete, the sweet communications of God are rarely so abundant as to conceal the root that remains behind, in such a way that the soul shall not be profoundly conscious of some deficiency, or that something still is to be done. Nor is the communication such as to allow it to enjoy the relief that is offered it perfectly, for it feels that there is an enemy lurking within, who, though he may be subdued and lulled, will yet return in his strength and assault it as before. And so it comes to pass, for when the soul is most secure, it is then plunged at once into another affliction, heavier, darker, and sadder than the previous one, and which, perhaps, will be of longer continuance. The soul again is convinced that all goodness is gone from it for ever. Experience cannot teach it. The blessings that flowed out of its former trials, during which it thought that its sufferings would never end, cannot prevent it from believing, in its present trials, that all goodness has perished from it, and that it will never be again as it was before. The present convictions are so strong, grounded on actual feelings, as to destroy within it all the occasions of joy. Thus the soul in this purgation, though it seeks to please God, and is ready to die for Him 1,000 deaths, for souls thus tried love God with great sincerity, nevertheless finds no relief, but rather an increase of pain herein. For seeking God alone to the exclusion of aught else, and seeing its own miserableness to be so great, it doubts whether God is not angry with it. It cannot then persuade itself that there is anything in it worthy of love, but rather is convinced that there is that in it which should make it hateful, not only in the eyes of God, but of all creatures also for ever. It grieves to see within itself sufficient grounds why it should be abandoned of Him whom it so loves and so longs for. Section 23 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Other trials of the soul in this state. Another source of affliction and distress to the soul in this state is that, as the obscure night impedes the exercise of faculties and affections, it cannot elevate the mind and affections to God as before, nor pray to Him. It thinks itself to be in that state described by the prophet, when he said, "Thou hast set a cloud before thee, that our prayer may not pass through." This is the meaning of the words I have quoted before. He hath shut up my ways with square stones. If at any time it prays with so much aridity, without sweetness, as to think that God neither hears nor regards it, as the prophet complains, saying, "Yea, and when I cry and entreat, He shutteth out my prayer." And in truth, this is the time for the soul to put its mouth in the dust, suffering in patience this purgation. It is God Himself who is now working in the soul, and the soul is therefore powerless. It cannot pray or give great attention to divine things, neither can it attend to temporal matters, for it falls into frequent distractions, and the memory is so profoundly weakened that many hours pass by at a time without its knowing what it has done or thought, what it is doing or about to do, nor can it give the least heed to what it is occupied with, notwithstanding all its efforts. Inasmuch, then, as the intellect is purified from its imperfect perceptions, the will from its affections, and the memory also from all knowledge and reflections, it is necessary that the soul should be annihilated herein, according to the words of the psalmist, referring to this purgation: "I am brought to nothing, and I knew not." This knowing not extends to these follies and failures of the memory. These wanderings and failures of memory are the result of interior recollection, by which the soul is absorbed in contemplation. In order to prepare the soul, and temper it divinely in all its powers for the divine union of love, it must, first of all, be absorbed with all its powers in the divine obscure spiritual light of contemplation, and detached from all affection for, and apprehension of, created things. This continues regularly in proportion to the intensity of its contemplation. Thus, then, the more pure and simple the divine light when it shines on the soul, the more does it obscure it, empty it, and annihilate it, as to all its apprehensions and affections, whether they regard heavenly or earthly things. And also, the less pure and simple the light, the less is the soul obscured and annihilated. It seems strange to say that the purer and the clearer the supernatural light, the more is the soul obscured, and that it is less obscured when that light is less pure. But this may be easily explained, if we keep in mind the philosophical axiom that supernatural things are more obscure to the intellect the more clear they are in themselves. Thus the ray of high contemplation, transcending as it does the natural powers, shining on the soul with its divine light, makes it dark, and deprives it of all the natural affections and apprehensions which it entertained in its own natural light. Under these circumstances, the soul is not only left in darkness, but in emptiness also, as to its powers and desires, both natural and spiritual, and in this emptiness and obscurity is purified and enlightened by the divine spiritual light, without its ever thinking of its presence, but rather thinking of the darkness that surrounds it. As a pure ray of light, unreflected by any object, is almost invisible, but becomes visible by being reflected, so the spiritual light which envelops the soul is, by reason of its pureness, invisible or imperceptible. But when it strikes against any object, that is, when we use it to discern between truth and falsehood, or any particular matter relating to perfection, it then becomes visible at once, and the soul perceives it then much more distinctly than it did before it entered this obscurity. In the same way it perceives the spiritual light which it has for discerning easily the imperfection which is present, as in the case of a ray of light, which is itself not visible, but which, if the hand or any object be passed across its course, the hand becomes instantly visible, and the presence of the sun's light is detected. The soul, therefore, inasmuch as this light is perfectly pure, clear, and universal, disconnected from all particular objects of the intellect, natural or divine, its powers are emptied and annihilated with respect to all such apprehensions, most easily and comprehensively understands and penetrates within all things, whether of heaven or of earth, according to the saying of the Apostle, "The Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God." It is to this universal and pure knowledge these words refer, which the wise man spoke by the Holy Ghost: "Wisdom reacheth everywhere, by reason of her purity." That is, because not connected with any particular object of the intellect or affections. The characteristic of a mind purified and annihilated as to all particular objects of affection and of the intellect is said to have pleasure in nothing, and to have no particular understanding, abiding in emptiness, obscurity, and darkness, embracing all things in its grand comprehensiveness, fulfilling mystically the words of the Apostle, having nothing and possessing all things, for such poverty of spirit merits such a blessing. Section 24 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. How it is that this night enlightens the mind, while it brings darkness over it. It remains for me now to explain that this blessed night, though it obscures the mind, does so only to enlighten it, and though it humbles it and makes it miserable, does so only for the purpose of exalting and setting it free. And though it impoverishes and empties it of all it holds, it does so only to enable it to reach forward divinely to the possession and fruition of all things, both of heaven and earth, in perfect liberty of spirit. As the primary elements which enter into the composition of all natural substances have no colour, taste, or smell peculiar to themselves, so that they shall combine with all colours, all tastes, and all smell, so the mind must be pure, simple, and detached from all natural affections, actual and habitual, in order that it may freely participate in the largeness of spirit of the divine wisdom, whereby, by reason of its pureness, it tastes of the sweetness of all things in a certain preeminent way. And without this purgation, it is altogether impossible to taste of the abundance of these spiritual delights. For one single affection remaining in the soul, to which the mind may cling either habitually or actually, is sufficient to prevent all perception and all communication of the interior sweetness of the spirit of love, which contains within itself all sweetness supremely. As the children of Israel, merely on account of that single affection or remembrance which they retained of the flesh pots of Egypt, could not taste the delicious bread of angels, the manna in the desert, which had the sweetness of every taste, and turned to what every man liked, so the mind which still clings actually or habitually to any one affection or particular mode of apprehending cannot taste the sweetness of the spirit of liberty, according to the desire of the will. The reason is this: the affections, feelings, and apprehensions of the perfect Spirit, being of so high an order and specially divine, are of another and different kind than those which are natural, and in order to be actually and habitually enjoyed, require the annihilation of the latter. It is therefore expedient and necessary, if the soul is to advance to these heights, that the obscure night of contemplation should annihilate it first, and destroy it in all its meanness, changing it into darkness, aridities, loneliness, and emptiness. For the light that is given it is a certain divine light of the highest nature, surpassing all natural light, and not cognizable by the natural intellect. If the intellect is to be united with that light, and become divinely transformed in the state of perfection, it must first of all be purified and annihilated as to its natural light, which must be brought actually into darkness by means of obscure contemplation. This obscurity must continue so long as it is necessary to destroy the habit, long ago contracted, of understanding things in a human way, and until the divine enlightening shall have taken its place. And inasmuch as the power of understanding, previously exerted, was natural, the darkness now endured is profound, awful, and most afflictive, because it reaches to and is felt in the innermost depths of the spirit. And inasmuch as the affection of love, communicated in the divine union, is divine, and therefore most spiritual, subtle, delicate, and most interior, surpassing all natural sense and affection, the imperfectness of the will and every desire of the same, it is necessary for the fruition, in the union of love, of this divine affection and most exquisite delight, that the will should be first purified and annihilated, as to all its affections and feelings, left in darkness and distress, proportional to the intensity of the habit of natural affections it had acquired, in respect both of human and divine things. And this must be done in order that the will, in the fire of obscure contemplation, wasted, withered, and deprived of all selfishness, like the liver of the fish on the burning coals, may acquire a pure and simple disposition, a purified and sound taste, so as to feel those sublime and wonderful touches of divine love whenever it shall be divinely transformed, and wherein all its former contrarieties, actual and habitual, shall be expelled. Moreover, in order to attain to the divine union, for which obscure contemplation disposes it, the soul must be endowed and replenished with a certain glorious magnificence in the divine communication, which includes innumerable blessings and joys, surpassing all the abundance which the soul can naturally possess. So speak the prophet Isaiah and St. Paul. Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of man what things God hath prepared for them that love him. It is necessary for it that it should be first brought into a state of emptiness and spiritual poverty, detached from all help and consolation, in all the things of heaven and earth, that being thus empty, it may be really poor in spirit and divested of the old man, and may live that new and blessed life to which it attains in this obscure contemplation, which is the state of union with God. And because the soul is to attain to a certain sense, to a certain divine knowledge, most generous and full of sweetness, of all human and divine things which do not fall within the common sense and natural perceptions of the soul, it views them with different eyes now, for the light and grace of the Holy Ghost differ from those of sense, the divine from the human. It is necessary that the mind should be brought low, and inured to hardships in all that relates to natural and common sense. It must suffer hardships and afflictions in the purgative contemplation, and the memory must become a stranger to all pleasing and peaceful notions, with a most interior sense and feeling of being a stranger and a pilgrim here, so that all things shall seem strange to it, and other than they were wont to seem. It must suffer hardships and afflictions in the purgative contemplation, and the memory must become a stranger to all pleasing and peaceful notions, with a most interior sense and feeling of being a stranger and a pilgrim here, so that all things shall seem strange to it, and other than they were wont to seem. For this night is drawing the mind away from its ordinary and common sense of things, and attracts it toward the divine sense, which is a stranger and an alien to all human ways. So much so that the soul seems to be carried out of itself. At other times it looks upon itself as if under the influence of some spell, and is amazed at all that is around it, all that it hears and sees, which seem to it to be most strange, though in reality always the same. The sources of this feeling are that the soul has become a stranger to the ordinary sense of things, in order that being brought to nothing therein, it might be formed divinely anew. Now this belongs more to the next life than to this. The soul suffers these afflictive purgations of the spirit that it may be born again to the life of the spirit through the divine influence, and in these pangs brings forth the spirit of salvation, fulfilling the words of the prophet, "So are we become in thy presence, O Lord. We have conceived, and been as it were in labour, and brought forth the spirit of salvation." Moreover, as the night of contemplation disposes the soul for that tranquillity and interior peace, which is so full of delight, as in the words of the Scripture, to surpass all understanding, it is necessary that the former peace of the soul, which, because involved in so many imperfections, was no peace, though it seemed to be a twofold peace, namely of sense and spirit, should first of all be purified, and the soul disturbed and repelled from that imperfect peace, as Jeremias felt and lamented in the words cited before, to express the trials of the night that is now past, namely, "My soul is repelled off from peace." This is a painful unsettling, full of misgivings, imaginations, and interior struggles, to which the soul, at the sight and in the consciousness of its own misery, imagines itself to be lost, and all the goodness to have utterly perished. In this state the mind is pierced by sorrow so profound to occasion spiritual groans and cries. At times it gives audible vent to them, and tears break forth, if there be any strength left, though this relief is but rarely granted. The royal prophet has well described this state, being one who had experience of it, saying, "I am afflicted and humbled exceedingly. I roared with the groaning of my heart." This proceeds from great sorrow, for sometimes the sudden and sharp recollection of the miseries that environ the soul produces such pain and suffering that I know not how to describe them otherwise than by the words of Job: "As overflowing waters, so is my roaring. For as waters sometimes overflow, drown, and fill all places, so this roaring, this sense of pain, occasionally so grows as to overflow the soul and drown it, so fills all its affections and energies with spiritual sorrows as to defy all exaggeration." Such is the work wrought in this night that hideth the hopes of day. It was in reference to it that Job said, "In the night my mouth is pierced with sorrows, and they that feed upon me do not sleep." The mouth is the will, pierced by these sorrows, which ceases not to tear the soul, neither do they sleep, for the doubts and misgivings which harass it give it no rest. This warfare and combat are deep, because the peace hoped for is most deep, the spiritual sorrow is most interior, refined and pure, because the love to be enjoyed is most interior and pure. The more interior and perfect the work, the more interior, perfect, and pure must be the labour that produces it, and the stronger the building, the deeper the foundation. "My soul fadeth within myself," saith Job, "and the days of affliction possess me." So in the same way, because the soul has to attain to the enjoyment and possession, in the state of perfection to which it journeys in this purgative night, of innumerable blessings, gifts, and virtues, both in the substance of the soul and in the powers thereof, it is necessary for it that it should consider and feel itself deprived of them all, and regard them as so far beyond its reach as to be persuaded that it never can attain to them, and that all goodness is perished from it. This is the meaning of those words of the prophet, "I have forgotten good things." Let us see why it is that the light of contemplation, so sweet and lovely to the soul that nothing is more desirable, for it is that whereby the divine union takes place, and whereby the soul in the state of perfection finds all the good it desires, produces these painful beginnings and awful results. The answer is easy, and is already given in part. This is not the effect of contemplation and the divine inflowing, from which comes sweetness rather than pain. The cause is in our imperfection and weakness, and in the dispositions of our souls, which is not fit for the reception of that sweetness. And so, when the divine light shines in upon the soul, it makes it suffer in the way described. Section 25 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. To make what I have said, and what I have still to say, more clear, I find it necessary here to observe that this purgative and loving knowledge, or divine light, is to the soul, which it is purifying, in order to unite itself perfectly to itself, as fire is to fuel, which is transforming into itself. The first action of material fire on fuel is to dry it, to expel from it all water and all moisture. It then blackens it and soils it, and drying it by little and little makes it light, and consumes away its accidental defilements, which are contrary to itself. Finally, having heated and set on fire its outward surface, it transforms the whole into itself, and makes it beautiful as itself. Thus fuel subject to the action of fire retains neither active nor passive qualities of its own, except bulk and specific weight, and assumes all the qualities of fire. It becomes dry, then it glows, and glowing burns; luminous it gives light, and burns much lighter than before. All this is the effect of fire. We theorize in this way concerning the divine fire of contemplative love, which, before it unites with and transforms the soul into itself, purges away all its contrary qualities. It expels its impurities, blackens it and obscures it, and renders its condition apparently worse than it was before. For while the divine purgation is removing all the evil and vicious humours, which, because so deeply rooted and settled in the soul, were neither seen nor felt, but now, in order to their expulsion and annihilation, are rendered clearly visible in the obscure light of the divine contemplation, the soul, though not worse in itself nor in the sight of God, seeing at last what it never saw before, looks upon itself not only as unworthy of the divine regard, but even as a loathsome object in the eyes of God. The comparison which I have instituted will enable us to understand what I have said, and what I purpose still to say. In the first place, we see how the very light, and that loving knowledge which unites the soul and transforms it into itself, is the same which purifies and prepares it. For the fire that transforms the fuel and incorporates it with itself is the very same which also at the first prepared it for that end. In the second place, the sufferings of the soul here do not proceed from the divine wisdom, it being written, "All good things came to me together with her," but from its own weakness and imperfection, from its being incapable, previous to its purgation, of receiving this divine light, sweetness, and delight. This is the source of its sufferings. So the fuel too is not transformed into fire at the instant of their contact, if it be not previously prepared for burning. This is the experience of the wise man, who thus describes his sufferings before his union with and possession of wisdom. "My entrails were troubled in seeking her, therefore I shall possess a good possession." In the third place, we learn incidentally how souls suffer in purgatory. The fire would have no power over them if they were perfectly prepared for the kingdom of God, and union with Him in glory, if they had no faults to expiate, which are the matter on which the fire seizes. For when that matter is consumed, there is nothing more to burn. So it is here, when all perfections are removed, the suffering of the soul ceases, and in its place comes joy as deep as it is possible for it to be in this life. In the fourth place, we learn that the soul, the more it is purified and cleansed in the fire of love, the more it glows with it. The more the fuel is prepared for the fire, the more it burns, though the soul is not always conscious of this burning of love within it, but only now and then, when the ray of contemplation shines upon it not so strongly. Then the soul is enabled to see, and even to enjoy, the work that is going on. It seems as if the hand of the artificer was withdrawn from the work, and the iron taken out of the furnace, so as to show in some measure the work that is being wrought. Then too the soul may see in itself that good which it could not see while the process was going on. Thus, when the flame ceases to envelop the fuel it burns, we see clearly how much of it has been enkindled. In the fifth place, we learn how it is that, after alleviations of its pains, the soul suffers again more intensely and sensibly than before. For after the manifestation of the work that has been done, when the outward imperfections have been expelled, the fire of love returns again to purge and consume away that which is interior. Now the suffering of the soul becomes more penetrating, deep, and spiritual, according as it refines away the more profound, subtle, and deeply rooted interior imperfections of the spirit. It is here, as with the fuel in the fire, the deeper the fire penetrates, the greater is its force and energy in disposing the inmost substance of the fuel for its own possession of it. In the sixth place, we learn that the soul, though it rejoices intensely in these intervals of peace, so much so that it seems to think its trials over, never to return, even while it is certain that they will soon recur again, cannot but feel, if it observes a single root of imperfection behind, that it is sometimes observed, that its rejoicing is incomplete. It seems as if that root threatened to spring up anew, and when that is the case, it does so quickly. Finally, that which remains to be purified and enlightened cannot now be concealed from the soul in the presence of what has been already purified. Thus the portion of the material fuel which is still to be set on fire is very different from that which the flame has purified. And when this purgation commences anew in the inmost soul, it is not strange that it should consider all its goodness to have perished, and that it can never recover its former prosperity, for in these most interior sufferings all exterior goodness becomes invisible. Keeping this illustration then before our eyes, and remembering what I have said on the first line of this stanza concerning this obscure night and its fearful characteristics, it may be as well to abandon the subject of these afflictions of the soul, and to enter on the matter of the fruit of its tears and their blessed issues, celebrated by the soul in the following lines. Section 26 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. A vehement passion of divine love, the fruit of these sharp afflictions of the soul. With anxious love inflamed. Here the soul speaks of the fire of love, which in the night of painful contemplation seizes upon it as material fire on the fuel it burns. This burning, though to a certain extent resembling that which takes place in the sensitive part of the soul, is still, in one sense, as different from it as the soul is different from the body, the spiritual from the sensitive. For this is a certain fire of love in the spirit whereby the soul, in its dark trials, feels itself wounded to the quick by a certain impression and foretaste of God, though it understands nothing distinctly, because the intellect is in darkness. The mind is now conscious of a deep affection of love, for this spiritual burning produces the passion of it. And inasmuch as this love is infused in a special way, the soul corresponds only passively with it, and thus a strong passion of love is begotten within it. This love has in it something of the most perfect union with God, and thus partakes in some measure of its qualities, which are chiefly actions of God, in the soul rather than of the soul, which is consenting unto them in simplicity and love. It is, however, the love of God only which, uniting itself with the soul, produces this warmth and force and temper and passion, or, as the soul calls it, burning. The more the desires are restrained, subdued, and disabled for the enjoyment of the things of heaven and earth, the more space does this love find for itself in the soul, and the better dispositions for its reception, so that it may unite itself with that soul, and wound it. This takes place during the dark purgation in a wonderful way, for God has so weaned the faculties, as they are now so recollected in Him, that they are unable to take pleasure as they like, in anything whatever. All this is the work of God, wrought with a view to withdraw the faculties of the soul from all objects whatever, and to concentrate them upon Himself, so that the soul may acquire greater strength and fitness for the strong union of love which God is communicating in the purgative way, and in which the soul must love Him with all its strength, and with all the desires of sense and spirit, which it could never do if the faculties thereof were dissipated by other satisfactions. The psalmist prepared himself thus for the strong love of the divine union, for he said, "I will keep my strength for Thee," that is, all my capacity, all the energy of my faculties and my desires, neither will I suffer them to rejoice in anything but Thee. Here we may perceive in some degree how great and how vehement is this burning of love in the spirit, when God gathers and collects together all the strength, faculties and desires of the soul, spiritual and sensitive, so that their harmonious combination may direct all its energies and all its forces toward the real and perfect fulfillment of the first commandment of the law, which comprehends within its scope the whole nature and gifts of man, namely, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with thy whole soul, and with thy whole strength. When all the desires and energies of the soul are thus recollected in this burning of love, and the soul itself, touched, wounded, and set on fire with love, in them all, what must the movements and affections of these desires and energies be, when they are thus wounded and burning with love, when that love does not satiate them, when they are in darkness and doubt about it, and suffering also, beyond all question, a more grievous hunger after it, in proportion to the past experiences of it? For the touch of this love and of the divine fire so dries up the spirit and enkindles its desires for satisfying its thirst, that it turns upon itself 1,000 times, and longs for God in 1,000 ways, as David did when he said, For thee my soul hath thirsted, for thee my flesh, oh how many ways, that is, in desire. Another version reads, My soul thirsteth after thee, my soul is dying for thee. This is the reason why the soul says, with anxious love inflamed. In all its works and thoughts, employments and opportunities, the soul loves in many ways, and longs after God. This longing is so manifold in its forms, always and everywhere abiding, that the soul has no rest, feeling itself to be wounded, inflamed with anxiety. Its then state is thus described by holy Job: As the servant longeth for the shade, as the hireling looketh for the end of his work, so I also have had empty months, and have numbered to myself wearisome nights. If I lie down to sleep, I shall say, When shall I arise? And again I shall look for the evening, and I shall be filled with sorrows even till darkness. The soul is in perplexity. It cannot comprehend itself, neither the things of heaven nor earth, and is filled with sorrows even till darkness, which, taking the words of Job in their spiritual sense, adapted to the subject before us, is pain and suffering, without the hope of light, or of any spiritual good. The anxieties of the soul while on fire with love is very great, because of their twofold origin. The spiritual darkness which envelops it is one, and afflicts it with doubts and misgivings. The love of God itself which burns within it is the other, and that inflames it marvellously, and excites it through the loving wound it has inflicted upon it. These two and simultaneous anxieties are thus referred to by the prophet: My soul hath desired thee in the night, that is, in my misery. This is one kind of pain which proceeds from the obscure night. Yea, and with my spirit within me in the morning early, I will watch to thee. This is the other suffering of desire and anxiety, which proceeds from love in the bowels of the spirit, that is, the spiritual affections. The soul, however, is conscious, amidst these obscure and loving anxieties, of a certain companionship therein and interior strength, which is so great that, if the burden of this oppressive obscurity were removed, it would oftentimes feel itself desolate, empty, and weak. The reason is that the force and courage of the soul flow passively from the obscure fire of love, and so, when that fire ceases to envelop it, the darkness, the strength, and the fire of love cease at the same time. Section 27 of the Obscure Night of the Soul, by St. John of the Cross. How this awful night is like purgatory. How the divine wisdom illuminates men on earth with that light in which the angels are purified and enlightened in heaven. What I have said enables us to see how the obscure night of loving fire purifies the soul in the darkness, and in the darkness also sets it on fire. We shall also see that, as the dark and material fires in the next life, so the loving, dark, and spiritual fires here purify and cleanse the predestinate. The difference is that in the next world men are purified by fire, and here purified and enlightened by love. David prayed for this love when he said, "Create a clean heart in me, O God." For cleanness of heart is nothing else but the love and grace of God. Blessed are the clean of heart, saith our Saviour, and it is as if he had said, Blessed are those who love, for blessedness can come of nothing less than love. The following words of the prophet also: From on high he hath cast a fire in my bones, and hath taught me, show plainly that the soul is purified and enlightened in the fire of loving wisdom, for God never grants the mystical wisdom without love, it being love itself that infuses it into the soul. David also saith that the wisdom of God is silver tried in the purifying fire of love. The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried by fire. Obscure contemplation infuses into the soul love and wisdom simultaneously, to every one according to his necessity and capacity, enlightening the soul and cleansing it of all its ignorances, according to the words of the wise man, He hath enlightened my ignorances. Here also we learn that the wisdom which purifies the ignorance of the angels, flowing from God through the highest down to the lowest, in the order of the heavenly hierarchy, and thence to men, is that very wisdom which purifies and enlightens the human soul. All the works of the angels, and all the inspirations they suggest, are, in Holy Scripture, truly and properly said to be their work and God's. For, ordinarily, his inspirations flow through the angels who receive them, each choir from the other instantaneously, as the light of the sun penetrates many windows at once, arranged one behind the other. It is quite true that, in one sense, the light of the sun pierces all, yet each window conveys that light to the next, modified according to the nature of the glass which transmits it, and somewhat weaker according to the distance from the sun. Hence it follows, with respect to the higher and lower angels, the nearer they are to God, the more they are purified and enlightened in the general purgation, the lowest in rank receiving their illumination in a less perfect degree. But man, being lower than the angels, must, when God raises him to the state of contemplation, receive that enlightenment according to his capacity in a limited degree, and with suffering. For the light of God which illuminates an angel enlightens him, and sets him on fire with love, for he is a spirit already prepared for the infusion of that light. But man, being impure and weak, is ordinarily enlightened in obscurity, distressingly and painfully, as the sun's rays are painful to weak eyes, till the fire of love shall have spiritualized and refined him, so that being made pure, like the angels, he may be able to receive with sweetness the union of God's inflowing love. There are souls who, in this life, are more perfectly enlightened than even angels. But in the meantime, this contemplation and loving knowledge come upon the soul through trials and loving anxiety. The soul is not always conscious of this burning and anxiety of love. For in the beginning of the spiritual purgation, all the divine fire is employed in drying up and preparing the soul, rather than in setting it on fire. But when the soul has become heated in the fire, it then feels most commonly this burning and warmth of love. And now, as the intellect is being purified in this darkness, it happens occasionally that this mystical and effective theology, while inflaming the will, wounds also, by enlightening the other faculty of the intellect with a certain divine light and knowledge, so sweetly and so divinely that the will, aided by it, glows in a marvellous manner, the divine fire of love burning within it with living flames, so that the soul appears to have received a living fire with a living understanding. This is what David referred to when he said, "My heart waxed hot within me, and in my meditation a fire shall burn," so vehemently that I thought it to be already on fire. This kindling of love, in the union of these two faculties, the intellect and the will, is to the soul a great treasury of delight, because it is certain that the foundations of the perfection of the union of love, for which the soul hoped, are laid in that obscurity. But the soul does not reach this sublime sense and love of God without passing through many tribulations, and accomplishing a great part of its purgation. For other degrees of this union, lower than this, which are of ordinary occurrence, so intense a purgation is not required. Section 28 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Other sweet effects of the dark night of contemplation. This fire of love throws some light upon the sweet effects wrought in the soul by the obscure night of contemplation. For occasionally, amid the obscurity, the soul receives light. Light shineth in darkness, the mystical influence flowing directly into the intellect, and the will in some measure partaking of it, with a calmness and pureness so exquisite and so delicious to the soul as to be utterly indescribable. Now God is felt to be present in one way, and again in another. Sometimes, too, it wounds the will at the same time, and enkindles love deeply, tenderly, and strongly. For, as I have said, the more the intellect is purified, the more perfectly and exquisitely, at times, are the intellect and the will united. But before the soul attains to this state, it is more common for the touch of the fire of love to be felt in the will than for the touch of the perfect intelligence to be felt in the intellect. This burning and thirst of love, inasmuch as it now proceeds from the Holy Ghost, is very different from that of which I spoke in the night of sense. For though the senses also have their part in this, because they share in the afflictions of the spirit, yet the root and living force of the thirst of love are felt in the higher portion of the soul, that is, in the spirit, conscious of what the soul feels, and of absence of what it desires. Still, all the pains of sense, though incomparably greater than those of the sensitive night, are as nothing, because of the interior conviction that one great good is wanting, for which there is no compensation possible. Observe here that, although this burning of love is not felt in the beginning of the spiritual night, because the fire of love has not yet done its work, God communicates to the soul, instead of it, so great an appreciative love of Himself that its greatest trials and deepest afflictions in this night are involved in the thought which harasses it, namely, that it has lost God, and that He has abandoned it. It may, therefore, be said that from the first beginning of this night the soul is full of anxiety, arising at one time from the appreciation of God, at another from the burning fire of love, and the greatest of its sufferings is this doubt. For if it could be persuaded that all is not lost, and that the trials it undergoes are, as in truth they are, for its greater good, and that God is not offended, it would make no account whatever of its afflictions, but rather rejoice in them, knowing that it is serving God. For the appreciation with which it regards God is so great, though in darkness and unconsciously, that not only would it endure its trials joyfully, but also die 1,000 times to please Him. But when the fire of love and the appreciation of God together have seized the soul, it then gains such strength and energy, and such eager longing after God, the effect of this glowing love, that it boldly disregards all considerations, and sets everything aside in the inebriating force of love, and without reflecting on its acts, it conducts itself strangely and extravagantly, that it may meet Him whom it loveth. This is the reason why Mary Magdalene, though noble herself, needed not the guests, high and low, who were feasting in the house of the Pharisee. She considered not that her presence was inopportune, and that tears were unseemly at the feast, provided she could, without delay or waiting for another occasion, reach Him for whom her soul was wounded and on fire. This is that inebriating force and daring of love, which, when she knew that her love was in the sepulchre, guarded by soldiers, and a stone rolled over it and sealed, allowed none of these things to move her, for she went thither before dawn with the ointments to anoint her beloved. And finally it was under the inebriating influence of love that she asked Himself, whom she took for the gardener, and who, she thought, had robbed the sepulchre where He had laid the body of her Lord. If thou hast carried him away, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away. She did not reflect upon the imprudence of her words, for it is clear that if the gardener had stolen the body, he would not have admitted the fact, and the less so, because she intended to take it away herself. This conduct of Mary Magdalene proceeded from the vehemence and energy of her love. For love thinks all things possible, and that all men have interest identical with its own. It cannot believe that there is anything to occupy men, or anything to be sought for by them, except that which occupies itself, and which itself is seeking, for it considers that there can be no occupation or desire beyond its own. Thus when the bride went out into the streets and broadways of Jerusalem, seeking for her beloved, she, believing that all were employed like her in searching for him, adjured them, if they found him, to tell him that she languished with love. So strong was Mary's love that she intended, if the gardener had told her where he had hidden her Lord, to take him away, in spite of the prohibition. Of this kind are those anxieties of love which the soul feels when it has made some progress in the spiritual purgation. The soul rises by night in the purifying darkness, in the affections of the will. As a lioness or a bear, robbed of its whelps, whom it cannot find, seeks them anxiously and earnestly, so does the wounded soul seek after God. Being in darkness, it feels his absence and is dying of love. This is that impatient love which no man can endure long without obtaining his wishes or dying. It is like that of Rachel when she said, "Give me children, otherwise I shall die." We have now to consider how it is that the soul, conscious of its own misery and unworthiness before God, can be so bold, amid the purifying darkness, as to aspire after union with him. The reason is that love gives its strength to love in earnest, it being the nature of love to seek for union, equality, and assimilation with the object beloved, so as to attain to the perfection of itself. And as the soul has not yet attained to the perfection of love, because it has not attained to union with God, the hunger and thirst for that which it has not, namely union, and the strength which love communicates to the impassioned will, render it bold and daring in its wishes, though the intellect, because it is in darkness, tells at the same time that it is an unworthy and miserable object. I am not disposed here to admit an explanation of the fact why it is that the divine light, being always light, does not illuminate the soul the moment it surrounds it, as it does at a later time, instead of bringing with it darkness and troubles. This question has been already partially answered, and I now answer it more fully. The darkness and misery of which the soul is conscious proceed not from the divine light which shines around it, but are in the soul itself, and it is the light which enables it to see them. When the divine light shines in upon the soul sees nothing at first but what is immediately before it, or rather what is within it, its own darkness and misery. Now, by the mercy of God, it sees what it saw not before, because the supernatural light had not shone round about it. This is the reason why, in the beginning, the soul is conscious of nothing but its own darkness and misery. But when it has been purified by the knowledge and perception of them, it will have eyes to discern the blessings of the divine light. And when its darkness and imperfections shall have been removed, it will then behold the great benefits and blessings of this happy night. This explains how great is the mercy of God to the soul, when He thus purifies it with this strong lie and bitter purgation, as to its sensitive and spiritual parts, from all affections and imperfect habits in all temporal, natural, sensitive, and spiritual respects. By obscuring its interior faculties and emptying them of all objects, by correcting and drying up all its sensitive and spiritual affections, by weakening and wasting the natural forces which the soul could never have done of itself, by causing it to die, as it were, to all that is not God, that, being wholly denuded and stripped of its former clothing, it may clothe itself anew in God. Thus the soul's youth shall be renewed like the eagle's, clothed with the new man, which according to God is created in justice. Now this is nothing else but the supernatural light shining on the intellect, so that the human intellect becomes one with the divine. In the same way, divine love so inflames the will that it becomes nothing less than divine, loving in a divine way, united and made one with the divine will and divine love. The memory also is affected in like manner. All the desires and affections too are changed, divinely according to God. Thus the soul will be of heaven, heavenly, divine, rather than human. All this, as is clear from what I have said, is the work of God, who affects it, during this night of the soul, enlightening it and setting it on fire in a divine way, with an anxious solicitude for God alone, and for naught besides. It is with great propriety and justice that the soul repeats the third line of the stanza, which, together with those that follow, I repeat again and explain in the following chapter. Section 29 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. In darkness and security, by the secret ladder disguised, O happy lot, in darkness and concealment, my house being now at rest. The soul continues to speak of certain characteristics of the obscurity of this night, again referring to the happiness of which it is the cause. It is replying to an implied objection, and says, in substance, let no man suppose that among the tormenting anxieties, doubts, misgivings, and terrors of that night of obscurity, it had run any risk of being lost. Yea, rather, it had found safety in the darkness, because the obscurity enabled it to escape from its enemies who were ever impeding its departure. In that obscurity it changed its garments, and disguised itself in 3 colours, of which I shall speak hereafter. It sallied forth by a most secret ladder, unknown to the whole of its household, which, as I shall show, is a living faith, in such secrecy, for the better execution of its purpose, that it could not possibly be in greater security, and the more particularly so, because in the purgative night the desires, passions, and affections of the soul are asleep, mortified, and subdued. And these, if awake and active, would never have consented to that departure. Section 30 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. How the soul journeys securely when in darkness. In darkness and security. The darkness, of which the soul here speaks, relates, as I have said, to the desires and to the interior sensitive and spiritual powers, which are all to be deprived of their natural light in this night, so that, being purified herein, they may be supernaturally enlightened. The sensitive and spiritual desires are lulled to sleep and mortified, unable to relish anything, either human or divine. The affections are thwarted and brought low, incapable of excitement and having nothing to rest upon. The imagination is fettered, and unable to make any profitable reflections. The memory is gone, the intellect is obscured, and the will, too, is dry and afflicted, and all the faculties are empty. And, moreover, a dense and heavy cloud overshadows the wearied soul, and alienates it, as it were, from God. This is the obscurity in which the soul says that it travels securely. The cause of this security is evident, for usually the soul never errs, except under the influence of its desires, or tastes, or reflections, or understanding, or affections, wherein it generally is overabundant, or defective, changeable, or inconsistent. Hence the inclination to what is not becoming it. It is therefore clear that the soul is secure against error therein, when all these operations and movements have ceased. The soul is then delivered, not only from itself, but also from its other enemies, the world and the devil, who, when the affections and operations of the soul have ceased, cannot assault it by any other way, or by any other means. It follows from this that the greater the darkness and emptiness of its natural operations in which the soul travels, the greater is its security. For as the prophet saith, "Perdition is thine own, O Israel, only in me is thy help." The perdition of the soul is exclusively its own work, the result of its own operations, of its unsubdued desires, interior and sensitive, and its good the work of God only. When the soul is hindered from giving way to these evils, the blessings of the divine union descend upon it forthwith, in its desires and faculties, which that union will render heavenly and divine. If, therefore, while this obscurity lasts, the soul will look within, it will see how slightly the desires and the faculties will have been diverted toward vain and unprofitable matters, and that it is secure against vainglory, pride and presumption, empty rejoicing, and many other evils. It is quite clear, therefore, that the soul which is in this obscurity is not only not lost, but that it gains much, for it acquires virtue. But here a question arises to this effect: why is it, seeing that the things of God are profitable and beneficial to the soul, and a source of security, that the desires and faculties are so obscured by him in this night that they cannot enjoy him or occupy themselves with him as with other things, but are, in a certain sense, less able to do so? To this I reply, that it is then very necessary for the soul to be clear of its own operations and devoid of all pleasure even in spiritual things, because its faculties and desires are base and impure, and even if they have pleasure in, and are familiar with, divine and supernatural things, it can be only in a low way. It is a philosophical axiom that all that is received according to the condition of the recipient. From this principle it follows that the natural faculties, being without the requisite purity, strength, and capacity for the reception and fruition of divine things in their way, which is divine, but only in their own, which is mean and vile, ought to be obscured with regard to the divine way, so as to secure their perfect purgation. They are to be weaned, purified, and annihilated first, in order that they may lose their own low mode of acting and receiving, and that they may be thus disposed and tempered for the reception and fruition of what is divine in a lofty and sublime way. But this they can never do, if the old man do not die first. Every spiritual gift, if it cometh not down from the Father of lights into the human will and desire, however much a man may exercise his taste, desire, and faculties about God, and however he much may seem to succeed, is still not divinely nor perfectly enjoyed. As to this I might here show, were this the proper place to do so, that there are many whose tastes and affections, and the operations of those faculties, are directed to God and to spiritual things, who perhaps imagine all this to be supernatural and spiritual, when in reality it is nothing more, perhaps, than mere natural and human acts and desires. As they regard ordinary matters, so also do they regard good things, with a certain natural facility which they have in directing their faculties and desires to anything, whatever it may be. If I can find an opportunity in the course of this discussion, I propose to enter upon this question, and describe some of the signs by which we may know when the motives and interior acts of the soul in the things of God are natural only, when they are spiritual only, and when they are natural and spiritual together. It is enough for us to know that the interior acts and movements of the soul, if they be divinely influenced by God, must be first of all lulled to sleep, obscured and subdued in their natural state, so far as their capacity and operations are concerned, until they lose all their strength. O spiritual soul, when thou seest thy desire obscured, thy will arid and constrained, and thy faculties incapable of any interior act, be not grieved at this, but look upon it rather as a great good, for God is delivering thee from thyself, taking the matter out of thy hands. For however strenuously thou mayest exert thyself, thou wilt never do anything so faultlessly, perfectly, and securely as now, because of the impurity and torpor of thy faculties. When God takes thee by the hand, guides thee safely in thy blindness, along a road and to an end thou knowest not, and whither thou couldst never travel, guided by thine own eyes and supported by thine own feet. The reason why the soul not only travels securely when in obscurity, but also makes greater progress, is this. In general, the soul makes greater progress in the spiritual life when it least thinks so, yea, when it rather imagines that it is losing everything. Having never before experienced the present novelty, which dazzles it and disturbs its former habits, it considers itself as losing rather than as gaining ground, when it sees itself lost in what it once knew and in which it delighted, travelling by a road it knows not, and in which it has no pleasure. As a traveller into strange countries goes by ways strange and untried, relying on information derived from others, and not upon any knowledge of his own, it is clear that he will never visit a new country but by new ways, which he knows not, and by abandoning those he knew. So the soul, when it advances in the spiritual life, travels in obscurity, not knowing the way. God Himself being the guide of the soul in its blindness, it may well exult and say, in darkness and security, as soon as it has penetrated the mystery of its state. There is another reason also why the soul has travelled safely in this obscurity. It has suffered. For the way of suffering is safer, and also more profitable than that of rejoicing and of action. In suffering God gives strength, but in action and enjoyment the soul does nothing but show its own weakness and imperfections. And in suffering too, the soul practices and acquires virtue, and becomes pure, wiser, and more cautious. There is another more particular reason why the soul travels securely when in obscurity. This reason is derived from the consideration of the light itself, or obscure wisdom. The obscure night of contemplation so absorbs the soul, and brings it so near unto God, as to defend it, and deliver it from all that is not God. For the soul is now, as it were, under medical treatment for the recovery of its health, which is God. God compels it to observe a particular diet, and to abstain from all noxious things, the very appetite for them being subdued. The soul is treated like a sick man, respected by his household, who is carefully tended that the air shall not touch him, nor the light shine upon him, whom the noise of footsteps and the tumult of servants shall not disturb, and to whom the most delicate food is given most cautiously by measure, and that nutritious rather than savoury. Obscure contemplation, which brings the soul so near unto God, is the origin of all these measures. For in truth, the nearer the soul is to God, the more obscure the darkness, and the more profound the obscurity, because of the soul's weakness. The nearer a man reaches to the sun, the greater the darkness and suffering its light occasions, because of the weakness and impureness of his vision. So great is the spiritual light of God, surpassing all understanding, that the nearer we approach it, the more does it blind us. This is the meaning of those words of the psalmist: He made darkness the covert, the pavilion round him, dark waters in the clouds of the air. Which is obscure contemplation, and the divine wisdom in souls, of which they have experience as of a thing near the pavilion where He dwells, when God brings them near to Himself. Thus, what in God is light and supreme splendour is to man obscure darkness, as St. Paul saith, and as the royal prophet explains in the same place: At the brightness that was before him, the clouds passed. That is, over the human intellect, the light of which, saith the prophet, is darkened with the mist thereof. O wretched condition of this life, wherein the truth is so hardly known! That which is most clear and true is to us most obscure and doubtful, and we avoid it though it is most necessary for us. That which shines the most, and dazzles our eyes, that we embrace and follow after, though it is most hurtful to us, and makes us stumble at every step. In what fear and danger, then, must man be living, seeing that the very light of his natural eyes, by which he directs his steps, is the very first to bewilder and deceive him when he would draw near unto God. If he wishes to be sure of the road he travels on, he must close his eyes and walk in the obscurity. If he is to journey in safety from his domestic foes, in his own senses and faculties. Well hidden and protected, then, is the soul in the dark waters close to God. For as the dark waters are a pavilion for him, they are also to the soul perfect safety and protection, though in darkness, where it is hidden and protected from itself, and from all the injuries that created things may inflict. It is of souls thus protected that the psalmist spoke when he said, "Thou shalt hide them in the secret of thy face, from the disturbance of men. Thou shalt protect them in thy tabernacle from the contradiction of tongues." These words comprehend all kinds of protection, for to be hidden in the secret of the face of God, from the disturbance of men, is to be strengthened in the obscure contemplation against all the assaults of man. To be protected in this tabernacle from the contradiction of tongues is to be engulfed in the dark water. That soul, therefore, whose desires and affections are weaned, and whose faculties are in darkness, is set free from all the imperfections which war against the spirit, whether they proceed from the flesh or from any other created thing. Such a soul may well say, in darkness and obscurity. Another reason, not less conclusive, why the soul, though in darkness, proceeds securely, is derived from that courage which it acquires as soon as it enters within the dark, painful, and obscure water of God. Though it be dark, still it is water, and therefore cannot but refresh and invigorate the soul in all that is most necessary for it, though it does so painfully and in obscurity. For the soul immediately discerns in itself a certain courage and resolution to do nothing which it knows to be displeasing unto God, and to leave nothing undone which ministers to His service, because this obscure love is so intensely vigilant and careful of what it is to do, and what it is to leave undone for His sake, so as to please Him. It looks around and considers in 1,000 ways whether it has done anything to offend Him, and all this with much more solicitude and carefulness than it ever did before, as I said when speaking of this anxious love. Here all the desires, all the strength, and all the powers of the soul, recollected from all besides, direct all their efforts and all their energies to the service of God only. Thus the soul goes forth out of itself, away from all created things, to the sweet and delightsome union of the love of God, in darkness and obscurity.